Hi guys, welcome to this week's or this month's webinar. We're going to be working on houses versus apartments. So we get a lot of calls in over every single week. There's a big deliberation between do you buy an apartment or do you buy a house? So what we want to do is try and put to bed the argument. There's no right or wrong answer, so whatever you get you can make money on, but certain properties suit a certain type of investor. Without further ado, we'll crack on. So first of all, in regards to apartments, what can they offer? The last 20 years have seen the rise of apartments. If you went back to sort of like the 80s and 90s, the majority of people that had buy-to-let portfolios probably would have been made up 90–95% of houses. Typically, they would have been local as well, because a lot of people purchase locally. So what would have basically happened is they would have had a bit of extra money spare, and a lot of people were landlords just because by chance. They weren't portfolio owners. They didn't own sort of 10, 15, 20 properties. It was something that they did because they had a bit of money spare, and they said, you know what, rather than put it in the stock market or a savings account, they went and bought a property. Simple as that. And they had one, and over the years they bought one or two properties, but it was typically they bought property that was local to them, and it was typically houses. However, over the last 20 years, we've seen a new trend, and predominantly that's for these high-end apartment buildings, city centre apartment buildings, and gradually we've seen the buy-to-let property market change. City centre living has changed, whereas typically what would people do is they would work city centre and commute in. What we're now seeing is people want to live city centre. There's far more to do in terms of in the actual buildings. You've got things like gymnasiums, cinema rooms, and in terms of the city centres where people would simply just commute in, now you're seeing that more and more buildings are being built. You know, London's kind of always been like that, but if you head towards places like Manchester and Liverpool, the skyline has dramatically changed. Even the last 10 years, if you take Manchester, you're seeing skyscrapers now go up, 40, 50, 60 floors high, whereas go back 10 years, and you might have seen one or two, like the Beetham Tower, but you typically wouldn't see a skyline like it is today. As I say, London, Manchester, Liverpool, and Birmingham, they've all seen the explosion of residential skyscrapers. Typically, the kind of skyline that we see in New York, that typical picture, the panoramic picture of the skyline in New York, it has become very synonymous with London as well. All the new buildings have all got names. So, you have like the walkie-talkie, the Gherkin, all of these buildings have names, and everyone can actually relate to that. So as soon as you say the Shard, you don't have to know anything but what the Shard is, and people won't have to describe where it is. People will automatically know where it is. The same in Manchester as well. If people say a meeting place like Beetham Tower, these are now getting their own unique names. So the apartments, as I say, over the last 20 years, we've seen a rise and a boom in the buy-to-let portfolios of apartments. They also offer occupants something different, whereas freehold houses offer things like a garden, and that's really the main reason why people rent a house, is because they have outdoor space. A lot of these apartments are now offering things such as pools, indoor pools, gymnasiums, retail space, roof terraces, communal roof terraces, and because of that, you're getting all the benefits of living on top of everything, whilst also having the benefits of the outdoor space as well. Typically, when people did a 9 to 5, they would, of course, be able to commute in. Now people are working longer hours, and with mobile phones in our hand, we're pretty much always working, or always at the end of an email. What's happening is people don't want that long commute in. So that the days where back in sort of 80s, 90s, where people could comfortably commute an hour into London, now people are looking at commuter belts half an hour max and trying to get a lot closer. That's why things like the new Elizabeth line, or the Crossrail as many people know it, people are trying to buy apartments in those kind of areas, and the people that have done have seen the prices dramatically increase over the last 3 or 4 years due to lines that are actually only 10, 15 minutes from London. In terms of houses, Again, they don't offer the same kind of facilities as an apartment block. You don't have your gyms, you don't have your swimming pools. However, what you do is you will have things such as the garden space, the freedom of having, if you have a family especially and you've got children, you may want them to run around in the garden, where you typically can't do that, especially when it's not so great weather. A lot of people want the freedom of being able to go in and out on a regular basis. So, especially in the UK, we can have sunshine one minute, showers the next. It's great with houses because your kids can go out there as soon as it rains, back in they come. Typically, you don't have the same benefits with the apartment block. They also, houses offer areas which are typically near a large open parks, recreational areas, forests, and again, because of that, you tend to find that the demographic of the tenant in houses will be families, whereas apartment blocks will be young professionals. When you choose your market that you want to rent to, this is why we say there's no right or wrong answer, because they will all rent, you will all get good yields, but it comes down to you. What is your main goal? Is your main goal to be hands-on? If it's so, you could deal with a house, no problem. Is it your main goal to get sort of emails every few months to say, something needs doing, something needs redecorating? What you've got to understand is, with families, typically there is a higher maintenance cost because kids touch the walls, kids draw over things, kids break things. So what you tend to find is those kind of properties will have a higher maintenance. Great income, but are typically a higher maintenance. You will have more things to do, more things to decide. Also with houses, especially houses of multiple occupation, HMOs, for short, you will need things like fire extinguishers in there, especially if they're over a certain amount of rooms, fire doors, licenses. So things like that have to be taken into consideration. Unfortunately, we have a lot of investors, especially first-time investors, that think, I'll go and buy a 5-bed property and I'll rent all the rooms out. It's not as straightforward as that. You may have issues with mortgages. You may have issues with licenses, issues with fire extinguishers. If you have someone that there's a fire in a room and there's something quite tragic happens, then you could, the next thing, there's been people that have gone to jail for not having the right things in place, like smoke alarms, like fire extinguishers. You see these things about rogue landlords, and it's actually more prevalent than you think. When we deal with houses, we make sure that all of that's there. It typically comes down to your letting agent to take care of everything. But of course, with that, there's a few more costs. So as I say, families tend to prefer renting houses as their location is more in line with their requirements. So typically, you won't have a large family renting city centre. Again, it all comes down to schools as well, because schools, you've got more choices of schools as you venture out. Typically within the city centre, if you've got a really good school city centre, you know that anything within that catchment area is going to have sky-high prices. So when it comes down to the pros and cons, again, there's no right answer. There's certain things that just need to be taken into consideration. So with a house, you need to have building insurance. Again, that's standard. The contents insurance is always dealt with by the tenant, but one thing that people don't realise is that you need to have building insurance. Typically, with an apartment, your insurance is covered by the service charge. So the service charge that you pay yearly, actually typically 9 times out of 10 is covered by, the insurance is covered by the service charge. What you need to find out is when you're reading the contracts is to ensure that that's correct. You always need to be asking that question. Is the insurance covered by the service charge? On a house, it obviously isn't, so you need to have buildings insurance separately. In a house as well, if you've got sort of a 3 or 4 bedroom house and it isn't rented to a family, it's rented to 1 or 2 people, you'll be surprised how many times that we've had people that phone up and ask about a particular property, and when we've spoke to them, they've actually had a house and it's been sublet. Now, that's most of the time that's not a bad thing. That's all well and good as long as your rent gets paid. But typically, if you've got a tenant in your property and they're subletting, you don't know who they're subletting to. You have no control over that. So certain things, if they damage the property, again, you're not covered. You have no control. In an apartment, you typically won't get that. You've got the concierge service. You've got CCTV. It actually diminishes the ability of someone who's hiding extra tenants. And you'd be surprised how much that happens in a house. In terms of the upkeep, the cost of the house on the face of it is quite minimal. You've got house insurance and that's it. It's a freehold. You've got a house insurance, of course, if you have a mortgage as well. But in terms of the so you compare apple with apples, the actual upkeep seems relatively straightforward. However, if it isn't rented out, you've still got to maintain communal areas, garden areas, outside space, potentially the redecoration of the exterior, things like the changing of the windows every however long. Typically, we'd say every decade to 15 years you want to be changing the windows. So there is still an upkeep to be had with a house. They also can suffer wear and tear because, as I mentioned, they're occupied by families. So because they're occupied by families, you can't get around from it. The kids have sticky fingers. They eat something, it's on their fingers. They rest up. They put their hands on the walls. They draw. They draw pens, pencils, crayons on the wall. So typically, after every let, you will have to do a minimum of a painting refurb. To maintain a good rental, you have to do that redecoration inside and out. It's very easy for a house to look run down in a very short space of time. So what we do for any houses of multiple occupation or any house that we rent out, we typically stay on top of it and say, look, you know what, you've got to factor in every year to redecorate that house. So regardless of what you make, you've got to take that into consideration. General maintenance issues, things like roofing, plumbing, electrics, that all needs to be taken into consideration as well. There's no point in buying a property with a 10-year-old boiler and then being surprised a year later that the boiler's gone. You're going to have a little bit more work to be done and more upkeep on a house than you first anticipate. There's still upkeep on an apartment. However, typically the occupants of a flat will be young single professionals or young couples. Now, they're very rarely there. You typically find that they are working all day, they go back, they eat, they're out, they're back in. So you'll tend to find that the majority of the day they're out, therefore, that's actually less wear and tear. Importantly as well, the need to redecorate because of this is less frequent. The costs are low, apart from the fact that you do have 3 costs associated with the apartment: service charge, ground rent, and of course you've got the management side, the letting side. So there's always 3 costs to be taken into consideration. But within that service charge, it will cover things like the maintenance of the communal areas, lifts, external decoration, upkeep of the grounds. And of course, if it does have things like swimming pools, gymnasiums, cinema rooms in there, it will also cover those kind of amenities as well. As an owner of the apartment, you don't need to worry about the external appearance. This is all taken care of for you. It's all done for you. So in regards to the property, you don't have to worry about the maintenance of the communal areas, maintenance of the garden. Now it comes to freehold versus leasehold. A lot of people feel that freehold's much better because they say that, well, I don't have to give my flat back after the leasehold expires. Well, typically what we say to people is that isn't the case. It's a misconception, the fact that you just simply give your flat back. Also, another thing is it's a misconception that you can't increase the actual leasehold. You can. What you don't want to be doing is buying something that is close to 80 years. That's the kind of precipice where it suddenly takes a bit more effort and a lot more money to increase that leasehold. But typically what we say to you is, if you've got a 125-year lease or over, you're absolutely fine. How long typically would you hold this buy-to-let? Are you going to be holding this buy-to-let in 40 years? The chances are no. If you've got a 250-year lease, are you going to be holding it in 250 years? Again, the answer is you've not got to worry about it. But most people prefer houses because of this perception that it's freehold and not leasehold, as most apartments are. The big advantage is there's no ground rent. That's the main issue between houses and apartments. With a house, you've got no ground rent, you've got the freehold. With an apartment, you've got ground rent. Now, typically, what we say to everyone is the key is it has to be below a certain percentage, which we'll come on to. Most apartments are leasehold, but not all. There are those that have ground rent charges that obviously have to be considered. What we say is you want the ground rent to be less than 1% of the value, because the reason that I say that is because of mortgages. A lot of people don't look at this at the start. They buy a property, they buy a leasehold, they have a £500 ground rent, and then they argue that, well, do you know what, the ground rent's expensive, but it's a great property and it has a pool and it has a private gymnasium and so on. That's all well and good. when it comes to mortgage, if that mortgage is higher than 0.1% of the value, you may struggle to get a mortgage. So what we say to everyone is make sure that the ground rent is less than 0.1% of the property. That's something that's key. In terms of the popularity, the housing popularity is still popular with families, but it's less so with the typical demographic of the rental market. What you've got to look at is who is the type of, what the demographic market typically rents. Well, it's typically people that can't get on the ladder, therefore students, young professionals, young couples. Once you get to the stage where you're a young couple with a family, typically you are earning the amount of money to be able to get onto that ladder. So therefore, the main demographic that rent, the students, the young professionals and the young couples, they are looking, the two of those are looking for apartments. The one, in terms of students, you have two kinds. You have students that want high-end apartments, and you have students that want an HMO. So HMOs make a fantastic let. Again, high income yields, high gross income yields, but also high costs. Again, we've got developments that we're doing at the moment, which we can take care of that, no problem at all. But that they just have to be factored in. Don't be under the misconception that houses are better than apartments, or even that apartments are better than houses. It doesn't work like that. It's just you've got to work out what's right for you. So in terms of the majority of the demographic market, the majority look at apartments. So as a result, the market for the houses is actually smaller. In terms of the apartment popularity, it is by far the most popular. My big factor for getting apartments as well is in a downturn, which we're going to have a downturn. There's no getting around it. Any property brokerage that say, no, we're going to keep going up for the next 20 years, it's a myth. There will be a downturn. Typically, apartments will stand the test of time. They will still rent out, because what you tend to then find is that any families that are living in a house, if there's a downturn, let's say everything fell by 20% today, well, typically those people that are renting a house, those young families, can now afford to go and buy. However, that young couple or that young individual still may not be able to, so they will still rent. So city centre apartments are more recession-proof than what houses are. Most renters, like the young professionals, they don't want the garden. They don't want the maintenance of a garden. You know, it's very rarely that 23, 24-year-old wants to actually go and mow the lawn. Typically, they want communal areas with balconies rather than the actual gardens. And also, with the affordability for first-time buyers still an issue, the rental market is still expected to grow dramatically. So, as I say, to summarise, there's no right or wrong answer. It's not a case of if you purchase one or the other, you're going to be right or wrong. It's just a case of what's right for you. So therefore, they both have costs associated with them: apartment, ground rent, service charge, lettings fee. Houses have more costs associated with them than people first anticipate: insurance, wear and tear, maintenance of the garden, maintenance of the exterior. They both have a good demographic in terms of rental market. Typically, apartments will have a stronger demographic in terms of the rental market, but houses still have a good demographic. So it's just about you, and sometimes it comes down to personal preference. I still feel in a downturn, apartments edge houses personally. But again, there are people that have got houses in their portfolios and they've done fantastically well. So in regards to the next steps, guys, you should have a speech bubble or a question mark where you feel free to ask any questions. I've seen a few come through already. So let's go, without further ado, go to the question. So first question. Where's typically the best areas to buy houses? Again, there isn't one. There isn't one particular area that's better than others. What I would typically say, if you're adamant that you want a house, and you're saying, do you know what, I can't get my head around leasehold and I definitively want a house, I would say get an HMO, which is rentable to students, because that is a demographic that will stand the test of time. What you don't want to be doing is getting a property that rents to families. House price falls, families can buy, families move out, and then you're left with an empty house for 6 months of the year. That's not ideal. You want something that can be rented to students, HMOs, so you want to look at university towns on the outskirts of places like Manchester, Liverpool, Preston, Newcastle, Sunderland, Leicester. Those kind of places will all have good quality houses that will be lettable to students, and you can make a good income off that. High income, high costs, but you're still netting a good yield. Typically, I would say that they're probably similar to what you can net from an apartment. They will both net the same. It's just that it might be a little bit more work to do. But again, that's something that a letting agent will do. Next question, are houses cheaper than apartments? Typically, yes. You would tend to find that the houses that you should buy, for example, if you've got £400,000, for argument's sake, in Manchester, let's say you've got £400,000 in Manchester, I would be advising people went for a 2-bed and a 1-bed. You should be able to squeeze just about a 2-bed and a 1-bed within that budget. I certainly wouldn't be going to buy a house of £400,000. That's not your market. It's not where you want to be looking. I would say that the typical HMOs and the houses you should be looking at are cheaper than an apartment, because obviously you're buying something that's on the outskirts. HMOs, maybe 3, 4, 5 bedrooms, and actually you can get cheaper properties. You can probably, whereas you can buy a 2-bed for 230 on the river in Manchester, which will still get you a phenomenal yield. In terms of if you did a short-term let on that, you could get up to still a 10% income. If you went out to the outskirts, you could probably get 2 properties on the outskirts of Manchester for that in terms of houses, and you would get a similar income on that. So in terms of what to spend, I would say the houses that you want to buy, if you're looking to do this kind of rent, should be cheaper than apartments, because you're on the outskirts and you're in areas, you're not looking at leafy suburbs which are high end. That's not what you're looking for these high rental houses. You're actually looking for properties which are on the outskirts, renting to students. What is the best time to extend a lease? Sorry, what is the best time to extend a lease? I've got one with 105 years remaining. You still got time, depending on how long you're looking to keep it. If this is something that you would like to keep, and you've envisaged that you're going to have this over the next 10, 15, 20 years, I would start thinking about that within the next 5 years. If it's something that you think, well, I'm going to keep it 5 years and move it on, I wouldn't worry about it. But if you think you may hold this in 20 years' time, when typically there'll be 85 years left of the lease, you want to start to be thinking about increasing that lease. Again, any solicitor worth their salt can do that for you, so you shouldn't have a problem doing that. But as I say, that typically depends on you and when you're looking to sell that particular property. What I would say is anyone that has a property at the moment, what you should always do on a regular basis is work out what you're actually making. Because a lot of people got their properties 10, 15 years ago very cheaply, and they think that they're making 15% on their property or 20% income. They're not. What you do is you have to simply do a very simple equation. You take the amount of net income you're getting now. That's your net income after all of your costs. So if you're getting 10,000 a year, but you've got £5,000 worth of costs, your net income is £5,000. So take your net income and divide that by the cost of the property now. So whatever the cost of the property is now, not what you paid for it originally, what it is now, and that is your true income. So for example, if you suddenly work out your true income and suddenly you realize you're only actually getting 2%, then that money can be better moved into another project, because it's a misconception, the fact that you bought it 15 years ago for 50 grand and it's now worth 500. You're not getting the same percentage. You think you are, but you're not. You need to work it out on what you're getting today. Next question, when buying apartments off plan, are the ground rents now being asked generally below 0.1% of the value? When I looked a few years ago, they were invariably above this figure. Correct, yeah, they were above this figure, and it's not something that's major in terms of it's going to have a huge impact on the market. But yes, what we're noting is less and less lenders are allowing mortgages to go through, so the mortgage market is getting tighter, and then now they don't want another 2008. Every bank, every lender, every mortgage broker, every government is scared of another 2008. This is why we're seeing more and more regulations go through. So typically now what we're doing, especially what we're doing as a company, we're keeping tabs on this. We work really closely with mortgage developers. We've got one particularly that we speak to literally every day on the updated news, and just to make sure that we're making sure that we advise the right projects, because what we don't want to advise a project and then again, let's be straight about it, we've fallen foul of that in the past where we've lent on a project and people have found it tough to get a mortgage. That's the reality of, that's how quick the market's changing. So we're trying to stay one step ahead and ensure that that doesn't happen. Next question, let's have a look. Do landlords require an ICO license, an HMO license for both houses and apartments? Well, again, that depends on the area. and it also depends on the HMO that you've got. So HMOs recently changed over 6 bed down to 5 beds and so on. What you need to do is it needs to be checked up in terms of your local local area. So some, for example, people like Liverpool, places like Liverpool, they do require now like a landlord's license that you have to pay, whereas there are other areas that don't. However, HMOs, it will depend on how many rooms in that particular HMO. Also, another question here. What are the typical costs? I heard it depends on the area and the property price. So would 5% of the current value, okay, sorry. So this is going back to the leasehold question. So what's the typical cost? It depends on the area and the property price. So would 5% of the current value extend between 85 and 95 years? Again, you are right. It does depend on a number of variables. And typically the freeholders who own the freeholder, it depends on that side as well. So what I say the best thing to do is, and feel free to email me if you want to, and I'll put you in touch with some lawyers in terms of the area. You're best to speak to a local lawyer or the lawyer who dealt with that development in the first place, and they will help out in regards to that particular project, because there's so many variables that I can't answer that question. I got my first house last month to live in. How many days do I need to wait to apply for a buy-to-let mortgage? So do you mean if the question is applying for a buy-to-let mortgage on the property that you're actually in, so you can move out? Typically, a mortgage company will look for at least 6 months of rental income in that particular property. In terms of how many days do I need to apply for a buy-to-let mortgage, if you're saying another buy-to-let mortgage on another property, there is no wait. You can apply for that tomorrow. But if you're saying that you want a buy-to-let mortgage on the property that you're in, it will need to be show at least 6 months worth of rental income, I would advise. Shall the investor aim to capital increase through increasing the house prices or through rental income? So shall the investor aim to increase their capital through increasing in house prices or through rental income? The answer is both. What we look for is not just income-based properties with no growth. What we look for is a mixture of the two. So therefore, that's why we advise that you look for areas which can offer both high-yielding investments and high growth returns. Places like London, they can't do either at the moment. London is falling in terms of its prices, and the rental market, although it's strong, the rental market is nowhere near the same parity as what it is in the north. You're typically going to make 2% in London net at best in most places on average. However, if you aim up north, that places like the Prestons, the Manchesters, the Liverpools, Sheffields, Leeds, those places, you will still get sort of 4, 5, 6% growth. And on a typical AST, which is like a 12-month let, you will still get that sort of 4, 5% net. And on a short-term tenancy where you can do sort of Airbnb style lets, we have a particular arm of our business, Skylet, which does that. You can make 8, 9, 10% net. So there's plenty of opportunities. But typically, I would say you should be aiming for both a capital increase and a high return as well. Would you say that apartments will still have capital growth over the next 5 to 10 years? Yeah, I would. It depends on the area. You can't say that, for example, let's take one particular area, it doesn't matter where it is, but you've got one particular area, it won't be a case that houses go up and apartments don't, or how apartments go up and houses don't. Typically, they increase generically within the area. So, for example, if you take Manchester, you'll say Manchester as a whole increased last year over 6%. But it won't be that, sometimes there will be a slight increase on apartments or a slight increase on houses, but you won't see a big disparity. You won't see apartments have jumped up 10% and houses have fallen 10%. That type of thing doesn't happen. But what we find is because most people want to rent apartments, the demand for apartments is a lot higher. Therefore, that's what's driving the price of apartments at the moment. So, guys, again, thanks for listening. As I say, there's no hard and fast rule. It just depends on you, the individual. Just make sure on a few factors. Make sure whoever you're buying from, again, have got a lot of experience, they're independent, they've got your best interests, and speak to independent mortgage brokers Feel free to speak to independent letting agents in the area as well to make sure you can get the rent and it can be sustained. And of course, anything you need from us in the meantime, take care. We have just got one more question that's just come through. Should we keep releasing equity? Should we keep on releasing equity, but chances we would pay capital gains tax on the purchase price minus the current value? Apologies, I don't understand the question. Sorry. Should we keep on releasing equity, but chances we would pay capital gains tax on purchase price minus current value? Best thing to do is email me, because I don't quite understand the question that you're asking there. So email me the question. So if any of you guys want to email me, it's Christopher.Whetstone, that's WHETSTONE, at flambardwilliams.co.uk. That's Christopher.Whetstone, WHETSTONE, at flambardwilliams.co.uk. And anything you want, guys, just ask, or feel free to phone in and ask for me, and I'll do my best to answer any questions. Well, lovely speaking to you all, and have a great rest of the week and a great day.